All right, we're back for our latest episode of Boardroom RevOps. We're bringing you valuable tips from RevOps experts so you can make it to the C-suite. Again, I'm James, co-founder of Accounting, the RevOps BI platform. Super excited to welcome Jeff Wadholm today. He's the SVP of RevOps at MeridianLink and an OG in the RevOps world. Jeff, great to have you on, man.
That is very generous. OG, I like dinosaur better. I think it more, it ages me better. Yeah, glad to be here, James. Thanks for having me. Yeah, one of the originals for sure, for sure. I think I was telling somebody yesterday, I was doing an interview and I said, I think I was like one of the first 4 or 5 people on LinkedIn that had a revenue operations title. The 3 or 4 of us that had those titles, we didn't know what we were doing back then anyway. So
I
the
feel
Stone
like
Age.
LinkedIn needs to like memorialize that in stone or something and be like, you
Yeah,
are
you
like
can
a
look at
pioneer
metal.
of the field. Yeah.
That's great.
That's great. Well, I'm excited to kind of that'll lead into the topic today, just kind of like your reflections on RevOps, how it's evolved, and just
Yeah.
like some of your thoughts around how you've been successful over time. Obviously, I mean, you can share a little bit more about your background, but you're the SVP of RevOps at MeridianLink. I think you've been VP or SVP at 2 or 3 other fairly large companies, and so I've kind of been around the block from a RevOps leadership perspective, and so excited to hear just kind of like, yeah, again, your reflections on that journey. But do you want to share kind of like your origin story in RevOps, your background, a bit more
Yeah.
detail for folks?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I like it. Thank you. And also, just in your intro, talking about the C-suite, and like the path to C-suite, I think it's such an interesting concept. Maybe we can unpack it here this morning. That like that is even a possibility today. From a revenue operation, someone who's kind of started there in my career. I'll spend a moment, but like started in finance, like a lot of RevOps people, I think start in finance. There's a lot of folks that come up through that organization, but to even have that be, part of a narrative, I think is really exciting and interesting. As mentioned, my dinosaur title, like I was early in revenue operations, and I think early on, a lot of us were sales operations background. It was, kind of like the first of the ops teams in go to market. But I started my career, I sold very unsuccessfully for a few years out of college. Was clearly not my calling. Spent a little time. I've got some funny stories about medical device. I was in the mortgage industry for a bit, and then moved into tech. Very early in my career. But I spent the first 5 years of my career in finance, working for the Office of Inspector General for the government. Started my career in technology with a big company based out of Amsterdam, like a big aggregator business with 6 billion in revenue and 5,000 employees. So got some really big experience in big corporate. A whole different beast, different animal. Publicly traded in the European markets, and but grew up in finance. And I think it is certainly, as I've talked about my career over time, having a finance basis is one of the things that I would attribute some of the success to. Right, finance is the language of business, and so if you're early career RevOps or mid career, and even maybe if you're late career, but you don't have that finance base, strongly advise scaling up in that space. There's a lot of information available. But I think it's foundational, right? Even if you've been adjacent to it but haven't dove in, like I always say, like touch the bottom of the pool, find out how dark it is, how deep it can be, how cold the water is, and finance is a great base to understand, go to market more effectively.
I'd actually love to click into that real quick, and I know you have a little bit more in your background to share, but why do you attribute that to some of your success? Like, is it the ability to tie go-to-market initiatives to the bigger picture and like the strategic
Yeah.
value for the business, or what?
Yeah.
What is so helpful about that?
Yeah, two things. One is exactly where you were leading, which is understanding financial concepts and why we do these things has helped me to not have an allergic reaction to some sort of change where we're driving towards business objectives. Maybe a business objective doesn't feel quite aligned to this empathetic of this, the sales challenges, right? But driving towards those business objectives, understanding how that kind of layer cake of building an annual strategic plan looks, and what do the growth levers look like, and how do you build a value creation plan? I think conceptually, those things are much easier to do when you've lived it, right? You've had your hands on the keyboard, you've been in the room, heard a big company CFO talking about the importance of them. I think is a really key piece to like being able to connect the dots. The so what gets incredibly important. And then two, the second part of that is like, you spend a lot of time doing financial modeling, understanding the power of data, spreadsheets, and formulas. And as most revenue operators know, like that's still a core part of what we do, right? I think tech has changed some of that over time. but I've worked in a lot of really cool companies. You can find kind of the names on my slide on my LinkedIn. And at the end of the day, there's still, a lot of us go back to Excel, go back to modeling, kind of go back to hardcore data. And so I think the combo of those two things is a really strong foundation for a revenue operations leader. Clearly not the only one, but I think there is definitely a group of us who have that finance background. I certainly have lost that over time. So, one of my teammates in finance today is watching this being like, dude, now you don't, right? But there's a kind of foundation that's still underneath there. I think understanding those concepts is really important.
Got it. Yeah, it's super helpful. Kind of like rounding out your background, maybe tell me more about how like RevOps has changed over time. So you started outside of RevOps, then to finance, then to sales ops. Like, what have you seen now versus then, and how about the
yeah, I mean, my transition was incredibly natural, right? I was a finance guy. I was a director of finance, leading a revenue side of the business. And I was doing a variance review with a then CRO who didn't have a CRO title because also didn't exist. And he was just like, hey, why don't you come over here and do what you do there, but do it on my side, And I was like, yeah, what's that look like, right? And that was still even early sales operations. It was over 20 years ago. And I think that kind of concept of like, how does forecasting, like finance teams forecast? They forecast revenue and like the revenue snowball and how SaaS translates over time, right? There's a lot of those kind of same concepts and business objectives, the finance modeling, the Excel, focus back then, certainly that translated, right? And how do we, track forecast? How do we build a pipeline? How do we think through data, quota, comp, fill in the blank on early sales operations topics? And I think what I have witnessed over time is, as tech companies have continued to kind of get swallowed up by private equity, you get into this concept of kind of like smallest footprint, biggest impact, right? And that's where I think the roll up of go-to-market functions and the need for data has, really stemmed from, right? Every organization, I think, it aspires to be data-driven. And there are certain forcing functions and, parts of the business journey where I think being data-driven becomes really important. And, as PE, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, really sniffed on how valuable the SaaS world is, I think that was a good driver to say like, hey, we really need to be able to look at businesses agnostic, less thinking about the industry and the specifics and really like a core set of KPIs and metrics. And I think that's kind of one of those drivers for how revenue operations came together, right? Is like, how do you build the smallest footprint and have the biggest impact, right? How do we think about like doing more with less instead of having 6 teams, have 1 team? And I think one of the benefits that I always see is like putting like-minded people together generally can build that kind of juice and momentum, that snowball rolling down the hill. And so like, while maybe somebody's really focused on marketing and someone's focused on success or customer support, somebody's, kind of sales operator, having that kind of creative DNA, maybe some of those like shared resources, a lot of in-team teaching and education like builds momentum in the business. And that evolution over the last, especially 10 years has really, I think, changed businesses, right? And now I think there's probably a question mark if you've got a growing business or an established business and you don't have a revenue operations function. There's a lot of people who would look at it and be like, are you sure?
I'm hearing a lot from private equity funds when they acquire a business. One of their first hires is a RevOps leader, actually.
First hire.
If they're buying a bootstrap company.
If you're in this space, especially if you're kind of like a long tenured role like I am, and a lot of my peers, there's probably 30 of us that have really been doing this for a long time. We hear from PE every day. Hey, we're looking for an operator. Hey, we're looking for a leader. Hey, we just rolled up a company. Hey, that is a very common entry point. My LinkedIn and my email is full of private equity looking for that. And it's because they see the value. They see the value. They understand that. And having that kind of like captain of go-to-market is really, really valuable to the business and the growth trajectory and value creation delivery. And it also ties back to where we started, that like eventually I envision that a lot of RevOps leaders are going to be in the executive C-level roles. And I think that's the next evolution.
For sure. Speaking of like executive level roles, again, you're sitting at the SVP level. You've done it a couple of times. Like, tell me kind of what you attribute to getting there. So we talked a little bit about like I'll call it the macro backdrop of RevOps,
Yep.
investors, executives starting to understand the value a bit more. Still
Yep.
challenging to actually get to like leading a team because I think the job
Sure
really
is.
changes over time. So kind of tell me about that journey for you, and again, what
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
attribute to that success.
It's a it's an interesting one, and while everyone's journey, I think, can be different, James. My view is it's a kind of a three-legged stool. The folks that have had a lot of success in this space get to a place where they can lead a revenue operations function cold. Come in, understand what metrics, what KPIs, what systems, which processes, like that piece you have to be locked on. To be able to like lead a big team in a growth space, you can't be learning on the job, right? And so there's this component of like maybe it's a little bit of experience, but it's not so much measured in time, but like repetitions and scar tissue, different things that you've seen, different models that you've delivered on. So it's like that to me is like the first leg of the stool that you have to have if you're going to grow a revenue operations career to a senior leadership position. The other two, I think, are the ones that like you can hit or miss on that I've seen done well and seen a little bit more challenging. One is taking that kind of tactical piece and making it strategic. How do you think about go to market strategically, about your model, your deployment, seller headcount, automation
Yep.
of marketing? How do you think about what really good customer experience looks like and creating that kind of like that flywheel, right? And then that third piece is like you've got to have leadership acumen. You got to be able to find great talent, develop great talent. And one of the things that's extremely common in this space is we're really busy. There's a ton of work going on. There's
Oh yeah.
competing priorities on a day-to-day basis. And that is a challenge that I would say, in my travels over the last decade, every revenue operations leader struggles with, right? Because I think we lose an appreciation for like, this isn't just a spreadsheet team. You're not just adding fields in Salesforce. Like there's a lot of stuff that kind of like cycles through our world. And so this leadership component of like, hey, how do you connect these dots? How do you make sure that your board and your ELT are satisfied with the work and understand what's going on here, but also connecting the dots between the folks that are on the ground in the trenches every day?
Yeah, and managing other executives too. I think the crazy thing about RevOps is it really touches virtually every function, the entire customer experience. So I think that's its
Truly,
own challenge, and where I see a lot of
truly.
like mid-level folks get kind of hung up.
You got it. Yeah. And so I think it's a great call. Is like you can get hung up there, right? And if you're thinking about kind of intentionally thinking about that three-legged stool, like I think a lot of folks will really focus on doing the work and getting the stuff done and getting the certification and making sure that you've got the automated workflows. But if you're not tying it back, kind of that strategic growth piece, it's challenging to be the real right-hand partner to a CRO or a COO or a big
Yeah.
CFO. But then also if you can't bring the team with you, right, and you can't develop the right culture and the right, operators to come do that, it can be a really like a churny part of the business, right? A lot of kind of dead bodies on the side of the road. It's like people's hair are blown back and you're like, dang, this is wild, right? Because pace and velocity are everything. And you're balancing it against kind of that kind of quality, quantity, dynamic. So it's a really
100%.
challenging environment to be at. But the people that do it the well kind of feel like they have that three-legged stool set up really,
Yeah, I think it's
really.
so well put, and you're alluding to the fact that I think a lot of RevOps folks, also in the mid-level, there's a lot of content out there and focus on systems, KPIs, data, all that stuff. Obviously, very important, kind of like table stakes. But tell me about you mentioned like a balance of the tactical versus the strategic, and so
Yeah.
I think people understand most of the tactical, although everyone can improve. Like, how do you drive like strategic outcomes? Like, strategy is even like a
Yeah.
nebulous term. So, do you have like a mental model or like just thought process for how you continue to keep RevOps strategic?
Yeah, that's a great question. Biggest challenge for the role, right, is because a lot of the work is very tactical. Um, this is a great question. First of all, like the fact that we're doing this is like one of the big challenges is when you're a revenue operations leader, you're probably the only one in the company who's done it, right?
Yeah.
When you think about like most of the other functions and verticals, when you like start at the bottom and you're a software developer and you move up the stack, generally speaking, the woman at the top of the stack has done the job that you did. And when you're in the sales stack, you become a chief sales officer. You started as an AE, and then you
Yeah.
became a director of sales and a VP of sales. And so you've got this kind of lineage for people to, kind of vibe with and understand and learn from. And so, like, I think that the role that we're in is unique because we're generally the only ones in the company who have been in this seat before, right? And so, like, it's stuff like this that like really helps people to say, hey, how do I build the mental model of moving from tactical to strategic? The number one thing that I think myself and I try to instill in my teams is like we teach people how to treat us. And so if you teach people to treat you tactically, they will treat you tactically, right? And if you teach people how to treat you strategically, they will treat you strategically. And kind of an analogy that I use, and I use it in a lot of different places, is like this concept of, and apologies if you're not a sports person, just try to bear with me on the analogy. If you're into music, I'm sorry, it doesn't work as well. But the idea of kind of being in a batting cage for a baseball player and then being a golfer, right? And so the idea is if you're in the batting cage and you're just swinging at fastballs over and over and over and over and over, that's a tactical motion, right? You watch that swing, swing, swing. The fastball comes 100 miles an hour. The next one comes 5 seconds later. The next one comes and you swing. Whereas a golfer, right, they take a completely different approach to the same idea, right? The same idea is I'm going to hit this little white ball down the way I want it to go. But a golfer, right, they stand around, they look at the right club, they grab some grass, they throw it in the air to see which way the wind's blowing. They go up to they take a practice swing, they shake their butt a little bit, right? They take their time, they waggle their club 10 times, and then they swing, right? And that kind of difference of how you approach your career and the interactions you may have with your CFO or your chief product officer, if you are tactical and you teach people to treat you tactically, I'll swing at every fastball. I won't take time to think about the request and think, okay, back to like where we started. How does this work? And how does this layer cake to the business objectives? How does this layer cake back to growth? What you can do is you can just get into that space. You're on the treadmill, you're sprinting on the treadmill and constantly doing the next report, the next field in Salesforce, the next HubSpot, the next automation. And while that can be kind of seductive, and I'm a big believer in lots of volume of work, if you're not pulling back and saying like, hey, how does this work into this strategic plan of how this business is going to grow? How are we going to increase the effectiveness and the efficiency of sellers? That's where you get stuck into the trap of being tactical, right? So it's
Yeah.
like we teach people how to treat us based on the way we do intake, right? And your intake might just be a one-on-one with your boss, right? So it may not be in like a dashboard. It might just be, okay, my boss has asked me for these three things. Pause, take 30 seconds and think about like, what's the root of this? What's the source of this? Is there a way that I can automate us through this so that I'm not into the, long distance sprint on the treadmill? And I think that can be kind of the seductive trap we get into, the busy trap, right? That's
Get
a
work
lot of
done.
roles.
Feels
But
good. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But I think for RevOps, it is really because it is such a centralized function, it's so cross-functional, it can be challenging. So I always say, like, first of all, we teach people how to treat us. If you take a moment and be a golfer instead of a baseball player in the batting cage, you can teach people how to do that. And then now we're connecting this back to the three-legged stool. Now you're thinking about, hey, I do understand some of the strategic initiatives. I'm thinking about our growth plan for next year. I'm thinking about what was said at the all team meeting or in the investor notes, right? Fill in the blanks on that. And now how do I be a leader and go deploy that into my organization, teach my team and the people around me why we're doing that. And then you can get into that kind of like three-legged triangle. I think people get stuck. We're just doing the bottom thing. They're in the
Yeah.
corner. We're actually doing it, updating the system, deploying the new AI technology, and you miss the triangle and you're stuck here in tactical, the treadmill.
Yeah, I think we teach people how to treat us is like the most poignant line I've heard in 50 episodes of this. And in my conversations weekly with, dozens of RevOps folks, I think it's so easy to just do and do and do and take the requests and people aren't thinking through their
Swing.
requests that you have to take a step back. Yeah.
Swing. Yeah.
And I think what you're kind of saying, and correct me because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is like being strategic in RevOps starts with prioritization, really, because prioritization requires that lens of the entire business. If we think about I know we're talking strategic, but a tactical step for someone to be more strategic, is it through being more thoughtful around prioritization? Is that like the first step?
Yeah, it is because everything is a priority. right? And that's not
Yeah.
unique to your business or mine or the ones I worked in the past or where you are. So everything's important, right? And there is definitely a opportunity for you to shift your own mindset and change the minds of those around you by not being reactive and kind of like falling out of the seductive cycle of the long distance sprint or the batting cage. That doesn't mean it's easy. That doesn't mean that I do it every day. But as you're looking at your career arch, and I am maybe in that director of sales operations or director of revenue operations, and I do want to understand that it's really about taking that time and just playing golf with your career, right?
Yeah.
In your one-on-one, after the board meeting, fill in the blank, whatever kind of business scenario it is. I think there's this moment of calmness where you need to think about the club you choose. You need to understand the wind. You need to understand what the grain of the grass is, right? And you take your practice swing, you shake your butt a little bit, you waggle your club, and you try to hit the perfect shot. And just taking a moment to have that mindset, to have the framework, I think is the way that people can more easily connect that dot. And then you go, okay,
Yeah.
now I understand the strategic importance of this for what we're trying to do as a business. Now my job as a leader is to go teach my team, why are we doing that? And how do we do that so that that cycle can continue? You don't get stuck in the bottom one, right? That's what I think
That's
it
great.
is.
I love it. I want to switch gears just slightly, but I think it's related. Tell me a little bit about how you think about leadership in your role. Like the funny thing about RevOps, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, because there aren't that many SVPs of RevOps out there actually. Like I think the
Yeah.
function is still getting to the leadership element,
Yep.
but I don't view that role as having a lot of like, I'm going to call it authority in the sense that you're kind of touching everything and making everything run smoother, right? But you're still
Yeah.
reliant on working with everyone else. So how do you think about like your authority in a business or even just how you influence like other
Yeah.
stakeholders when there's so
Yeah.
many things going on?
Yeah, I think what I'll first do is I'll give like I'll excuse all of us and give a little bit of grace because I think that like that concept is really important to a lot of us. But what I've seen in my own career and in my peers, kind of the dinosaur group, right? I know my dinosaur friends are giggling. Is that it is business by business, right? And so
Hmm.
like if you really desire to be this strategic, trusted advisor, and the business isn't in a place for that, you can be kind of fighting gravity, right? And so
Yeah.
I think there is a business model, personnel, focus area component to that question that we should all go, hey, we need a little grace here. We're still, kind of wedging our way in. In some ways, this is a kind of a Trojan horse to try to get into the business and infiltrate, but it also like doesn't mean that every organization and every leadership team is ready for that conversation or that kind of partnership, right? So if you're not there, that may not be a failing of your own. It just might be, hey, this is the business and where we're at in the journey. We're not
Totally.
quite there yet, or we haven't seen that deployed yet. So um, but I think it does tie back a bit to we teach people how to treat us, and also like there is a challenge that you have a challenge with a newer function like revenue operations. There are not a lot of people who have had a lot of experience, right?
Hmm.
When I look, when I go to hire somebody and I need to hire a director of fill in the blank in one of my organizations, like the talent pool is great with really high performers, but not a lot of tenure, right? Because it
Hmm.
is newer function. So you find a lot of people with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years of experience in this space. Not a lot of people with 12 or 15 or 20, or, like you might in a sales role. If you're hiring a seller, you might be like, yeah, I've been a lifetime seller. I've been doing this for 15, 20 years. And so while I truly believe that you can accelerate your own experience in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you may only have the ability to see 2 or 3 business models, right? Or 2 or 3 turns of the crank on like how this thing will go. And so I think for a lot of us, it's like we got to give ourselves a little grace. We have to like kind of work through that, and we have to have those conversations like with our CRO, with our CMO, with our CGO about like what does that look like? How do I make that? How do I make sure I'm a good partner to you? And then you get into fundamentals of career growth, right? It's like,
Hmm.
hey, what can I do for you today? What can I do to make your life easier? And I think we can get into really stuck on building reports and making it really easy for sellers or fill in the blank. But that broader career arch and that trajectory does require us to take that next step and say like, hey, like, how do I position myself? How do I teach you to treat me as a strategic partner and
Yeah.
bring thoughtful contributions to things like your value creation plan, right? we have to realize we still are kind of one of the newer functions in a lot of businesses. Customer success is a little bit the same way. It's a newer function. 25 years ago, you probably didn't have any VP of customer success. You didn't have any VP of revenue operations, but you had a VP of sales. You had a VP of product. You had a VP of finance. And so like, we got to give ourselves a little grace. We also got to know that we're kind of sprinting to catch up, but also like, you can't just wait forever. We can't just be, well, in 20 years we'll be there. We have to kind of, chart our own path. And that happens through those strategic conversations, acknowledgement of that, and trying to, hit as many business models as you can, and learning knowledge from stuff like this podcast, right?
Yeah, I think it's really well put. Sadly, we only have a few minutes left. I want to round this out by hitting like that final leg of your three-legged stool, which I think is a great analogy. And that was on the leadership component. We kind of touched on like, I would call it like the executive layer of leadership so far. But I want to talk about like you and running a team. And I think most of our listeners are probably like directors of RevOps. And so like I think coming up is starting to build a team for the first time. So I think you've led pretty big teams now. But to the extent you remember like when you were just starting to grow teams, maybe the early days of joining a company, how do you think about like effectively expanding a RevOps team? And this can be anywhere from like getting the buy-in for more resourcing to actually, running that team effectively.
That's a great question. I have a lot of thoughts that flash through my head. I'll try to be brief, so I'm not like, dragging this one out.
Could probably do another episode on this.
It is, yeah. This is a whole episode, right? I think there's one kind of mental mindset that I have, and the way I lead my own teams, we call it the "and" strategy, and it's like bench pressing a barbell, right? Like you can't have different size weights on either side. You got to do both equally. And on one side, you have the culture side, the human side, the personal development side. And like I always believe that we agree as a team that we get to really invest here and care a whole bunch about this. But the commitment that we need to make on this side is that we have to kick a lot of ass and be a high performing, accountable culture team, right? So we need to be able to have our finance partners rely on us, our sales leaders rely on us. Like we have to do both. And I think it's really easy to fall into the trap of like the teeter-totter. We're either like all here and nobody's getting invested in growing in, or we're all culture and fun and this performance goes down and it's like this cool team that never delivers, right? And so if we're thinking about that like a barbell, we're doing that, and your leadership kind of like kind of like the push-pull is around how do you do this and how do you make sure that this happens, right? And I think like when you do those things and this performance comes, what you'll start to see is you can grow your team by not saying, hey, we need more resources because the work is bigger than the output, but hey, we've demonstrated value to this business, and one more incremental headcount means more incremental value, right? And that's a very different discussion with your CFO or whoever your kind of like buying advisor is that's saying, hey, am I going to spend another $100,000? It's a lot easier to say, here, let me show you the demonstrated value, and here's what the incremental value to this business could be. Because we look at our growth trajectory and where we're going, that piece is way different than we're so damn busy. There's too many reports. Like we just got the new systems. Can we please get another head count because everybody's drowning, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a little bit of teach you how to treat us and how you talk and the way that
and also, Jeff, you kicked off by saying that you were a failed seller, but that's just sales to me. You're talking about like a perfect sales process. Show the value and get the upsell, basically.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And that's what happens over time. You've learned, oh, hey, this is the value proposition, but it's got to be genuine, right? Your team, if you're in that kind of like treadmill, right? We're back to the same three. If we're in the treadmill and you're sprinting and it's so busy, I need more people to keep our head above water, is very different than I have intentionally built my three-legged stool. I have treated this role like I'm a golfer. And now I'd like to incrementally grow this team because I can demonstrate value because we use that and strategy. The people are here, they're delivering value, they committed that we will kick ass and be a high-performing team. If those two things happen at once, that's where this thing starts to hop, right? Yeah. And the same kind of caveat I gave before is like, not every business is ready for full growth there, but that's your job as a leader, is to work through that. And that might not happen overnight, it might not happen in 2 quarters, but as you think about the career evolution and a revenue operations leader, that's the kind of magic dust that lives in there.
This is great. Sadly, we're just about at time, Jeff. I think we might have to do a second episode later in 2026 on that topic. Any final thoughts, again, as you just think about people who are trying to get to where you are today? Anything I should have asked that I missed to kind of cap us off here?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the beauty of revenue operations is your background and where you started don't dictate or determine what's next for you. There are sales enablement leaders who migrate into revenue operations. There are sellers who decide that this is a kind of more attractive place for my skill set. There's people like me with finance backgrounds. There's people that come from marketing. And I think, the number one message I would say to that person who's in year 2, year 4, year 5 of the space, and maybe you're kind of at a stuck point, is take 2026, draw your own kind of three-legged stool and say, hey, how much am I investing here? How much am I investing here? How do I think about this? And if you're just light on one of those skills, you're like, hey, like connecting the dots and the strategy piece is really challenging for me because I'm so busy over here. Find a mentor. Find one of the dinosaurs, find a great CRO who's ready to talk to you about that stuff. Go read the book, go take a couple of MBA courses to help with you thinking about like you go to market growth and strategy connection and the AOP planning process and how do these things work. And then make dang sure that your leadership component, that last piece, has to be connected so your team can roll with you, right? That's where the team accelerates together. But it can be really easy to get stuck in one of those three pieces. Just have a little strategy and be really thoughtful about it.
Love it. Well, listeners, you heard it here first from an OG or a dinosaur, rather, in RevOps. Jeff, thanks so much for coming on, man. This was really enlightening and a lot of fun.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. And also, let me just take 1 second. Thanks for doing this, James. Like, this is the area where we learn because, like I said earlier, we don't always have that next person to look to in the organization. We look to content like this. So you're doing really good work for the community. I watch and I learn as well every single day. So every podcast that I click into, I'm like, ooh, I got to take that one note. Find a piece of gold nugget, put it in your little playbook, and then go deliver on it. Make 26 great for yourself.
Well, thanks a lot. It means a lot, but the pleasure's all mine. It's so much fun getting to talk to great operators. So thanks again, Jeff. This is great.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it.